So, welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. If you're in Asia, it's good evening. Welcome back to our learning series, Understand, Design, Act, Climate Proof Your Supply Chain. I hope you all had a good summer break. So we skipped August so everyone could take a nice break and get some time off with families and friends. And now we will continue with Module 5, How do I know my investment in climate smart agriculture is working? Next slide, please. So today we have an array of experts that will bring the topic to you, which is Kili Sloan from Sustainable Food Lab, Daniele Giovannucci from COSA, Pablo Ruiz from the Neumann Stiftung, George, colleague of mine from the Global Coffee Platform, and Bambi Samrock from Conservation International. And as moderators, Catherine Selengia from the Hans R. Neumann Stiftung and myself will take you through this webinar. Next, please. So let's look at the agenda today. We're going to show you different models of measuring impact at the farm level, at the sector level, and also at the landscape level. Next, please. Yeah, some of you might not be familiar with Zoom. So if you want to raise your hand and say something, that's later when we come to the question and answer session, just raise your hands and then we can unmute you to ask any questions. But you can also use at any time the question and answer box to put your questions in there, and we will organize them to the speakers to have them answered as best we can and as much as time allows. Being a webinar, you know that the microphone is silenced to avoid any background noises. However, you can raise your hand if there are any questions. And remember, we record this session so that we can put it on the website, and for anyone who wasn't able to join today can listen and look at the slides later. Next slide. Yeah, looking at this learning series, we have started off with an introduction of terminology, looking at risk profiles, then also the tools that are available to address climate change, how to scale, and today we will look at monitoring and measuring. We bring this series to you in order to understand the topic better, but also to do the next stage, then design a project or join the opportunities that we are offering and act. So the two opportunities we are working on are in Honduras and Uganda. And here we sent out a survey to the participants, but also a wider stakeholder group. Unfortunately, we have had not as many answers as we had hoped, but nevertheless, we had a good turnout of organizations showing their interest in Honduras and Uganda. We are already in discussion with these organizations that have shown interest in certain topics in those countries. And we are also in direct outreach to discuss tangible projects to address climate smart agriculture in these two countries, to in the end to get a commitment and to work together to come up with a topic that we will address together. In the lead here is the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, ARC, and Kate will also tell you a little bit more about this later, how we're addressing that. And with that, I hand over to Kili, I think.
Yep, thanks so much, Caroline. So now we are at, how do I know my investment in CSA is working? So I'm Kili Sloan from the Sustainable Food Lab based here in the United States. And we work with food and beverage companies through a variety of means to help make supply chains more sustainable and more resilient. For our company partners sourcing from smallholders, evaluating resilience to climate change poses some particular challenges. Smallholder sourcing entails working with many diverse farming communities around the globe, each with its own agricultural practices, cultural context, and risk exposure. and companies often lack fine-grained visibility into smallholder performance due to the length of their supply chains. Even companies closer to smallholder farmers often seek guidance on how to translate data on climate risk and smallholder performance into targeted action plans across their sourcing geographies. Hearing that, and in collaboration with the Feed the Future Alliance for Resilient Coffee, the Food Lab and Root Capital created an introduction to assessing climate resilience in smallholder supply chains. This document guides companies through a 5-step process of how a company can approach measuring supply chain resilience at the farm and cooperative level, and how using those results can help them to build more resilient supply chains. The first 2 steps are know your risk and know your farmers. Using a combination of historic climate data, recent climate and weather observations, and modeled climate projections like the suitability and impact gradient maps presented earlier in the series by CSA and shown here on the left, decision makers can identify supply chain segments most exposed to climate change risk and then identify suppliers and partners in those high-risk areas. Areas can generally be put into 3 types of zones. Absorb zones, where the area will likely remain suitable for target crop production, shown here in green. Adapt zones, where the area will likely remain suitable, but suitability will decline, shown here in yellow. And transform zones, where the area will no longer be suitable for the target crop production without major adaptation. The next step is to understand farmer and cooperative resilience. Using a set of example metrics, these largely taken from COSA's body of resilience metrics that will also be presented today, a company can map livelihood assets, human, physical, social, natural, and financial capital, and identify suppliers' capacity to absorb, adapt, or transform. With absorptive capacity meaning the ability to avert or minimize disturbances through preventative measures, short-term coping strategies, and incremental shifts in management practices. Adaptive capacity meaning the ability to make proactive and informed choices in the short to medium term about how to adapt to disturbances, including taking advantage of new opportunities arising from change. And transformative capacity, meaning the ability to transition to an alternative stable state in the long term based on changing conditions. Next, risk and resilience are looked at together. In order to be resilient, a system's resilience capacity must match the severity of the threat. As you can see in this graphic here, with the severity of threat in yellow and resilience capacity in green, resilience capacity must at least equal the level of shock exposure in order to bounce back to its original state. That would be the middle graphic you see here. Whether diagnosing at the farm, cooperative, or landscape level, you'll want to be able to map resilience to the climate risk faced. Mapping risk to resilience helps to inform more targeted interventions that build resilience in response to threat and allows for companies to design interventions with measurement in mind to be more effective in seeing progress. Relevant indicators from the diagnosis phase can be used to inform a baseline, monitor progress, and/or evaluate results, while also making sure that activities are aligned with strategic objectives. When writing this guide, we intentionally didn't seek to recreate the wheel to come up with another set of resilience metrics, but use those from other presenters on this webinar, drawing heavily especially from the COSA. And with that, I will hand it off to Daniele to further dive into farm and household metrics.
Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be with you today. I see that one of our slides has taken an interesting artistic manifestation, but here we go. For those of you who happen not to know COSA, let me just briefly tell you that we are a collaborative organization. We work to convene global partnerships to benchmark and understand best practices, whether that's within the UN system, across leading global companies, or of course, local institutions and many, many research agencies as well. Our purpose is quite simple in this space. We look to provide the critical insights, or to help organizations understand the critical insights that will catalyze their best practices. And doing that of course, with science-based systems that measure what matters rather than trying to have everything be optimal or ideal. Now, today I wanted to share with you, and if you can cue the next slide, the approach that, well, one of several approaches that we think is quite critical to understanding and to having success in climate work. Climate effects, of course, are an intrinsic part of sustainability and a vital part of resilience. But to be effective in addressing climate issues, we must understand that there are also social factors and economic factors that blend or that have a dynamic interface with those environmental factors of climate change, and together create resilience. Resilience is a web, is a way of avoiding future problems, a way of creating a strengthened and a more capable community. And certainly at the farming level, that's absolutely vital. So the first step for us is to understand in resilience tools that climate has to be integrated, of course, it's critical, but has to be integrated with other factors. In the last 2 years, we've been working with colleagues across the world who are leaders in that space. They range from great research institutions like CIAT, to the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and the Sustainable Food Lab and others, to develop a robust set of indicators, metrics, and guidelines for resilience that can be implemented in the field at a reasonable cost. The science is there. The challenge for many organizations, especially even governments and certainly field projects and corporate efforts, is to have these insights at a reasonable cost and in reasonable time, so having it happen quickly. Q. The work that Keely mentioned has a lot to do with the different capacities of a farm or a community, of the transformative, the absorptive, and of course the adaptive. And it can get complex. Just looking at that slide might make a few of your eyes roll. So it doesn't have to be, though. And cue the next one. We can work a lot on indices, and we've been working on that to help convey the key factors in a much more understandable way, in a way that is accessible even to a local community, not just at the policy or at the government level. And that's a vital part, I think, of the future of many of these concerns around climate, because they are very, very regional. They're very distinct. And so we have to build that capacity to understand also at the regional level, not just at the supranational or at the governmental level. Please cue. The way we've done that is to develop a full set of indicators that are very accessible, and there are 76 of those. They are useful for a good understanding of resilience over time, an impact assessment, if you will. You can ascertain the attribution of change with those. But we've also worked, Q, on a smaller group of 27, a core set, if you will, of indicators, Q again, that will take you into the hotspots or the most important areas of resilience in a community, Q. And finally, for those who really have no ability to invest or to look at these issues, and they still are interested, you can even rely on a very basic set of core proxies that help understand what's going on in resilience. And so making it as simple as possible to get a foot in the door, to at least begin an understanding without having to make it either complex or costly. Please cue. And cue twice, actually. Thanks. So that's work that's been ongoing, and it's recently taken on, I think, a very interesting new dimension, and that is, in the last couple of years, the ability to look at that across landscapes. And we've done that with a number of institutions, some building on the resilience side, others with considerable capacity to look at landscapes and mapping leaders such as Conservation International and others. And even most recently within the work of the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, too. that work essentially takes us into the realm of big data, which of course is used widely for most of the climate modeling and has enormous benefit. Q, the aspects of big data that we all know related to climate risk and many other factors, often ecosystem focused, but sometimes also working on the issues of demographics and census and other facets of big data that are highly interesting to understand the trends in the big picture. Q, the other facet of this is, though, the necessary integration, Q, of local data, and that local data is what gives context to the big data. So this is big data married to small data. The project that we did in concert with Conservation International and with the Coalition for Coffee Communities that I think Bambi may reference in a few moments, had a lot of this approach embedded in it. This idea of really understanding the data of local people, whether that's a municipality or a district, but also at the household level, cooperatives, traders, certification agencies. And by having that data overlaid into the big data, we really begin to understand the roles and the drivers of change, and those are key factors. So it's vital, for example, to understand deforestation rates, but equally vital to understand the drivers. How can you affect that change, Q? So one way of doing that, and I regret that today we won't be able to take you online to actually look at all of these functionalities, but here you can see at least a little bit of the sense of how one could apply this. This is in Chiapas, and there's a government program there to adopt climate smart varietals, Roya resistant in coffee across the region. And while that's an enormous benefit, of course, the government has insight pretty much into what it does. In other words, the distribution of seeds and seedlings, which is of course the first and necessary step. But the level of adoption and then the actual level of mortality in the field is critical. In some cases, it's quite high, and you can mouse over on a map a particular municipality and see what's actually happening, see if you're getting the adoption rates, see if the plants are actually surviving and doing well or not, and therefore be able to address at a local level the efforts that are needed to create a successful program. Not waiting until the end of the program to do an evaluation, but actually having data in real time from cooperatives, from communities, feeding into what a government is now able to see so that it can better target its interventions and focus on its areas of interest, therefore getting more success. And of course, there are many layers you could use on these mapping systems. You can look at the coming change in say, moisture levels, rainfall indices, or temperature in particular areas, and be able to actually plan ahead. If you're the governor of Chiapas or you're the Ministry of Agriculture in Mexico, to be able to plan ahead specifically in regions for the kinds of climate change factors that are coming. So being able, for example, to propose more drought-resistant seeds rather than the highest yielding seeds in some communities for corn or maize and beans would be a tremendous asset, as you might imagine. Q. And finally, the idea of putting all of this into a package, making it visible, right? If these systems are only usable in Washington or in Mexico City or in anywhere, it's really not optimal, right? So the idea of creating high quality visuals, having everything at your fingertips so that everyone can see the key factors right there on their screen and be able to drill down as necessary into detail, but also be able to effectively manage and see what's going on in a program or a project with a clear and a dynamic dashboard. So I'll stop there. I know we have limited time and there are a lot of good folks coming. Please cue to the next slide. And just to cap the points that I made, these practical tools are, the idea is how to manage, not just to know, but to manage Q resilience. And there are three functions of that. One is the aspect of all of these being pragmatic, that you can get the key insights on the things that matter, right? Not focusing on a million things, but the things that matter. Q again. The second point is the fact that we absolutely need to understand, if you'll cue the slide, we need to understand, oh, we've gone off there. The idea of having things be simple, having them be easier to share, and having them finally be low cost. So I'll leave it there, and thank you all very much.
Apologies for that. My PowerPoint decided to turn off, so just give me 1 second. And sorry about that, Daniele.
That's quite all right. All right, it worked. No worries.
We'll share that last slide for just a minute.
Ta-da.
Ta-da! Thank you, Daniele. That was very interesting. And now we're going to move on to Pablo Ruiz from HRNS, who's going to talk about on-farm measurement. Pablo, you can go ahead whenever you'd like.
Thank you. So, thank you for the opportunity. We would like to share what we have been doing in the last years, trying to understand what is the vulnerability of the coffee farms. And for that, we designed a climate vulnerability tool for coffee production. Next, please. So, what are we doing? We are trying to measure what is the vulnerability of coffee production and the farmers. And for that, we are measuring the exposure, how farmers are perceiving the different climate risks, if they are facing droughts, if they are facing high temperatures, which is really the climate hazards that they are being affected. Then, which are conditions that makes coffee to be sensitive. So for example, coffee is sensitive to high temperatures during the flowering. And what are the activities that the farmers are doing? What are the agronomical management that they are implementing to improve their adaptive capacity? So we create this tool, and basically we made this questionnaire in Survey CTO that help us to create many different points in a coffee landscape where we can measure climate vulnerability. And the current indicators that we are measuring, it is adapted to the conditions from Guatemala and Honduras, but I think that in essence, it has many conditions that can be applied in other regions, and the tool can be adapted to different conditions. Next, please. So, which are these components? Like, we are measuring the farmer characterization. So there we can see gender, we can see things like the age of the farmers, we can see if he is participating in a farmer organization or not. Then we start to analyze how he is doing the farm administration, how the farmer received technical assistance, and what are the current networks that he had, what are the climate and extreme events that he had been suffering in the last years, what is the presence of pests and diseases, which conditions he had in soil management, how he is managing the crop, the coffee crop, and then how he is protecting the forest and the water. So finally, in each of them, we are trying to measure what is the exposure, the sensitivity, and what is the adaptive capacity. So for example, with soil management, the exposure that they could have is the slope, sensitivity is erosion, and the adaptive capacities that he can do is planting using contour lines, using light barriers, and establishing cover crops. So finally, what we do with these climate indexes to analyze all these characters, all these different characters, and finally the tool give you a final assessment that includes all these different components to understand what is the vulnerability of this farmer. Next, please. So as results, we can determine what are the climate events that farmers are perceiving that are affecting them most. We can understand what are the climate impacts that these climate events have generated. We can identify also which practices farmers are adopting to adapt to climate change. And finally, all of that, we can evaluate the results at farm level, but also we can understand what the farmer organization is doing or not, how farmers are being affected according to different altitudes. So are the farmers in the lowlands being affected more than the ones from the highlands? And even it can help to understand what is the vulnerability of a municipality in a certain region. So finally, how we see is that these results can help private sector to understand what are the climate risks in their sourcing regions and how they can help farmers to adapt to climate change. Next, please. So this is some of the results that we had seen, like for example, if the square is bigger, he had a better adaptive capacity. If the square is smaller, he had a lower adaptive capacity. And you can compare between different farmer organizations. Like for example, here we were comparing a farmer organizations that is the blue one, that is called Ocrevistol in Western Honduras. That is a farmer organization established a long time ago. So you can see that the adaptive capacity of this farmer organization was better than one that was recently established. So you can compare results between different organizations or between different locations. Next, please. So the opportunities that we see with these tools is that we can pilot the tool in different locations in Guatemala and Honduras. That it's a service that we will offer with the ARC project. Finally, that will be helping us to understand better how is climate vulnerability in the coffee production. And finally, as much as we create databases, we will be able to understand how farmers are being affected by climate change and how they are responding in different years. So thank you very much, and we will be happy to answer any questions. And please contact us if you would like to work in this tool.
Thanks so much, Pablo. We appreciate it. And next, we're going to move on to George Watene from GCP, who will talk about sector level metrics.
Thank you very much, Hilly, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. As mentioned, we take it to another level where now we start thinking of sector-wide measurement in terms of then seeing how far your investment is going. Again, at this point, what we're going to look at is really a lot of money, like we've seen in the projects, is spent in trying to get coffee sustainable. And this particular project is really at aligning how we get to tell whether we are making a difference or not. Q. Again, this process, of course, has taken the effort of many, and part of the work started way back in 2016, but in 2017, you know, GCP, the challenge with partners, the Sustainable Coffee Challenge with partners and also members looked at a sustainable progress framework, which ideally looks at how we could make coffee the first sustainable product through different pathways of ensuring sustainability. But one of the other products that came out of that process was 8 key outcomes that we identified that then would tell whether we are making progress in our sustainability or not. And these included things like income, access to resources, equality, water quality, forests, and of course, sustainable purchases, productivity, and quality. So the part of common metrics is really looking at how from those proposed outcomes, how do we measure the progress on those outcomes? And the idea is really to use this as a guide to the industry in terms of telling whether our industry is getting more sustainable or not. So further work was done with the help of GCP and partners in trying to prioritize what common indicators we could use for this reporting. And a lot of these, of course, being multi-stakeholder involves a bit of voting, but also trying to rationalize these with the discussions that are ongoing on sustainable development goals. So the common indicator work is actually an extension of trying to align how we measure the common outcomes in the sustainability progress framework, Q. So just to give a snapshot of some of the areas and some of the indicators proposed. Again, this is a proposal, although part of it has been adopted by some of the industry players and sector players. But for instance, in terms of economics, some of the things that were the issues that we saw, again, prioritizing, because there are many issues. And like you've seen, even when it comes to an issue like climate, there are many things that you can look at it on. But the idea for these was to prioritize so that we can, like someone told me, have some barometer to tell whether we are on the right direction or not. So some of the key issues that were seen in this area were issues to do with profits, issues to do with yield, the costs of production, issues to do with the efficiency in the chain, partly, of course, also on returns again against the whole chain. And the other part, of course, is the issue of sustainable purchases, which is important then because when farmers and players work on sustainability, then we also need to have a market for which, or demand for what is produced sustainably. And some of the indicators proposed on these are issues to do like net income from coffee, issues to do with productivity improvement to an optimal target, because we know in some places the challenge is maybe overproduction, and other challenges is really production very way below what your potential is. On the issue of cost, again, it's looking at indicators such as optimization of costs. In terms of chain efficiency, again, being a bit farmer-centric, looking at, of course, the share of the FOB price that the farmer receives, so that then, of course, you're trying to see whether the returns are distributed, in a way that then is helpful. And last but not least, on the issue of sustainable purchases, and particularly on this particular one, this definition has been agreed upon, and especially when I talk from GCP part, by retail members and retail and roster members who have agreed to report at that level, Q. On the issue of social issues or improved well-being and livelihood, some of the key areas are issues to do with poverty, and for that, of course, SDG 1 is really key on that. Issues to do on return, either to workers and so on. Issues to do with child labor. Hunger on SDG 2 is also a key issue. In terms of the well-being and livelihoods of both maybe workers and farmers at large. And last but not least, of course, issues to do with labor practices. And again, for these issues, then coming up with a set of common indicators that then people can use, to tell on whether on that particular identified core issues in regard to the sustainability of the sector, how can we tell what progress we are having on that particular area, Q. Then last but not least, and in an area that is also relevant to the things we are discussing today, is the area of conservation of nature. And on this one, some of the key core elements in relation to coffee are things to do with forestry and ecosystem protection, issues to do with input and specifically fertilizer use, issues to do with water use, and pesticides or pest control and hazards, and last but not least, the issue of soil. And particularly for these, we are looking at things of seeing the issue of deforestation, issues to do with the optimized use of fertilizer, either based on soil analysis, issues to do with water efficiency, whether it's in irrigation or it's in processing water for those that wet process their coffee. On issues of pest control, of course, it's the optimized use of that in terms of inclusion of other sustainable measures like IPM. And then, of course, then seeing how far you are in terms of fertilizer use. And then last but not least, of course, adoption of soil management practices. But that's really a high level look at, a proposal and Q. The reason why we need, of course, or the reason that such indicators are necessary is, of course, because like we've seen, we can measure so many things and measuring can become overwhelming. But can we agree as an industry, at least a set of some things that if we measure, at least for those of us that believe in the Pareto principle, gives you, I would not say 80%, because the things that I've just shown do not give you 80% of the problems that we are facing in coffee, but at least get you close to focusing on issues that then tell you a lot about how far you are in ensuring that coffee is a sustainable product. On the other part is also help in having a common message, because if we all agree on a common way of looking at issues, then even the feedback that we are able to give is common. So if we agree that, for instance, that yield is an issue, and we agree on measuring that, then of course, even the product of that measurement then comes out in a common language. And last but not least, we don't measure for the purpose of just measuring. Even the topic of today's webinar is really, we are measuring to tell how far our investments are going. And then Q, maybe to finalize on this state, one of the parts of then pushing this dialogue further is, as a membership organization, that is GCP, we also have maybe the responsibility or the ability to encourage our members, to work on these issues as a start, as the rest of the sector takes. And some of the common ones that have been agreed upon, for instance, the issue of sustainable purchases. We also, the coffee barometer that came out earlier this year. But the idea is that the members of GCP have agreed to ensure that annually a similar level of effort is put voluntarily for them to show that. Then other areas that are also being encouraged, and again, we are trying to look at innovative ways of doing this so that then, like Daniele has just shown, the fact that the issue of cost of doing this work in relation to the return that comes out of it is not overwhelming. So issues of yield, wages, and water use have been discussed as other areas to voluntarily test as members. And at the end of the day, there is more information from this. But we also realize that there are also other innovative ways of looking at things. And on the issue of deforestation, of course, there is the look at how we can innovatively maybe collaborate with organizations that are able to utilize other technology to give us the information that we need. And case in point here, we have the Global Forest Watch with GFS Pro. And for those of you that follow information on media, you also see how one of the biggest buyers of palm oil is working with Sterling, to try and answer the same question. So again, the key points are common ways of looking at things, but also ensuring that there's efficiency and resources are used effectively so that then we can learn more and in cheaper ways. Q and thank you.
Great, thank you so much, George. That's really interesting, and I know that we'll all be watching this initiative unfold with bated breath. So thank you again. And now we are going to move on to Bambi Semruk from Conservation International, who's going to talk about landscape level measurement. And Bambi, did I already pass your first slide?
You just unmuted me, so thank you.
Sorry about that. There you go. I have a trigger finger.
That's okay. No, thank you for the opportunity to participate in the webinar, and we're really thrilled to talk about how we think about all of what you've heard to date. And I think Daniele hit upon this in the closest in terms of thinking about how do you take what we know about farms and think about this more at a landscape level, and then use the landscape level thinking to inform, again, what we do at the farm level. And so if you go to the next slide, it's just a graphic of how this kind of plays out. And I think a lot of times we think about how do we take what we know about the farm and scale it so that we're affecting landscapes. And that's kind of the way that coffee supply chains tend to think about these things. Okay, what's happening on the farms? If we do it on more and more farms over time, are we getting scalable impact at an efficient cost and rate and return on investment? And from a conservation point of view, as Conservation International, which is a conservation organization working on environmental sustainability and improved livelihoods and showing that people really need nature for sustainable economic development and actually to thrive, we're always looking at this from more of like the landscape level, like where are the landscapes that are really important for people? And then what do we need to be doing to conserve them? And how are commodities like coffee affecting them? So what we're trying to do through more and more of our work is try to figure out where do these two meet in the middle? Like what can we learn from like the farm level, like the localized data that Daniele was speaking of, and how do we pair it with what we know at the big data level and the landscape piece? How does that help us prioritize where we're targeting investment? How does it prioritize what we're investing in, and enable us to actually get some kind of rate of return impact at scale? And how do we even know if we're getting any impact at scale? So how do we monitor that at this landscape level? Do the next slide. So it is kind of a new way of thinking. And so we worked, as Conservation International, we work in landscapes throughout the tropics on conservation. And this landscape assessment framework really came out of how we monitor our landscape work. And then what we were working with COSA and the Coalition of Coffee Communities in Hinotega was how do we adapt that for a coffee-driven landscape and a coffee-driven approach. And so through that effort, we've revised our landscape assessment framework to think about, okay, what do we want to see in a sustainable landscape? And it really comes down to like three things in terms of impacts and one thing in terms of drivers. So first of all, we want to see from a conservation point of view, the natural ecosystems and resources are conserved or restored. So if they're already highly degraded, how do we restore them to the capacity that we need them to be a sustainable landscape and to provide the ecosystem services back to the communities and back to the coffee, if coffee is in that landscape. So that's about pollination services. It's about natural pest and disease control that the forest actually can provide back into that ecosystem. It's about climate mitigation and stabilizing the local microclimates. It's about providing clean water for the communities to drink, but also rainfall regulation, those types of services. So the nature provides all of that back into coffee, and we're trying to make sure that the nature continues to provide that for sustainable coffee production. But in these landscapes, we also need to make sure that people have economic livelihood. So, and usually that's a lot of agriculture. And so we're trying to make sure that agricultural systems, and in a lot of places it's coffee, that they're economically viable and that they can be resilient to climate change. And that links into all the work that Pablo and Daniele and Keely mentioned earlier. We're also trying to make sure that if we're doing this right, rural livelihoods and the well-being of all social groups are improved, so that they have the income they need to send their children to school, they have the health care services, they have the economic opportunities to actually improve their livelihoods and the livelihoods of. And so in order to make that all possible, we need to make sure that there's local decision-making processes that are inclusive and equitable. And the way that Conservation International thinks about this a lot as well, we have two other pillars that you don't see here. One is that there's good governance in these areas. So we work a lot with governments in terms of what are good policies, what are enabling policies that should be put into place to support these types of outcomes. And then the other one is to make sure that we have sustainable financing flowing into these areas to support and sustain any investments that we do over the long term. Next slide. So when we think about, how we do this, and in terms of why we need to look at this at a farm, at a landscape level, and move away, not away from, but actually add to the farm level pieces, it really comes down to, if we look at the farm level, there's on-farm deforestation, there's on-farm reforestation and tree planting, there's shade and shade management systems, there's erosion control and riparian buffers, there's all these good environmental practices for on-farm systems. And what happens at the landscape management level is we're looking at, how does what happens on a farm by farm basis add up and increase kind of forest cover, connectivity of forests, so that especially wide-ranging species that are in coffee areas. So we have tigers, we have orangutans, we have pumas and jaguars in and around coffee areas. So how do we connect big pieces of forest so that we don't have genetically concentrated populations that aren't able to kind of mate and procreate with others in different areas. So we need that connectivity so you can move through the landscape. These animals and species can do that. And then the other piece of landscape management that is really, really important is freshwater. In terms of freshwater doesn't stay put, it comes from the rain, rainfall hits the ground, it flows down the mountains into streams, and coffee is on those mountainsides. And so we have to manage for freshwater flows, making sure that the forests continue to provide the climates that enable, rainfall patterns to continue. And then we also need to control for erosion, fertilizer drift, that kind of thing, out and making sure that we have good riparian buffers to provide that freshwater quality control. And a lot of times those riparian buffers are also the means of providing the connectivity in these landscapes. So if those are naturally vegetated buffers, we can create connectivity next to streams, waterways, rivers, those types of water bodies. Next slide. So what we've done is to try and show that link between the two is we have this tool called the Landscape Assessment Framework, and it's really a tool to evaluate and monitor the status and trends and key indicators that characterize the landscape sustainability, but also that disseminate the results. And we do that in a dashboard similar to what Daniele presented, but it's really a series of graphs, charts, statistics, maps to try and show what's happening at this landscape level. And next slide. And the steps to doing this are really, we try to use existing data. We're not trying to go out there and collect a whole lot of extra data, because we know that in most programs of work, most projects, about only 10% of your budget, most maybe 15% of your budget is to do with monitoring. And so we're using a desk review of existing data. We're creating these online dashboards to present initial findings. And then we're doing field visits to the landscape. That includes interviews with local actors, as well as ground truthing of satellite images. And then revising those initial dashboards and presenting a final draft of an analysis of the landscape in a summary card, which is usually 2 pages, one with the graphs and images, and another with a narrative that shows kind of what the risks, what the opportunities were, and where we think investment should be going towards. And we use that as a stepping stone into how we engage with communities. So it's not a static thing that sits on a shelf, but we use it as a way of engaging more stakeholders in these landscapes to develop common action plans and investment strategies across the coffee producers, the NGO community, the corporate community, and the government agencies themselves. Next slide. So I'll give you a little bit of a taste of what this looks like. As part of the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, we've been working in Ocotepeque in Honduras. It's a region, a very mountainous region in Western Honduras with about 150,000 people living there. Relatively dense forest cover, which is great from a conservation point of view. But there is continued deforestation due to agricultural expansion and urbanization in the region. And a lot of that agriculture is coffee. And it's coffee expanding into forest areas. And this is high conservation value forest, so it's part of a large biosphere reserve that is a a transnational reserve that spans portions of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, which can make the governance of that biosphere reserve quite complicated. So next slide. So some of the results, and this is what those dashboards or cards kind of look like at the end of the day. These are just some of the pieces out of it. So on the front page, you'd see a large lengthy narrative, which will not show, but on the back side, you'll see a lot of these kind of maps and graphs. And so at the left side where you see land use change, you'll see a map of Honduras. This is the western portion, so where that little red area is what we're looking at. And then what we do is we map forest cover change from 2000 to as late as we can go, which in this case was 2015. And what you can't see on this map is what you see in the green is where there's still forest, and where you see some of the reddish areas, which are more in the northern central section, are these highlighted areas where we've lost forest in that 15-year period. And that helps us pinpoint, okay, why are we losing the forest and what does it mean? And so we look at this from a point of view of is the legislation effective? Where are we losing forests? And so that's what that first top graph in the forest cover and biodiversity piece shows in terms of where are we losing the forest. In the protected areas, not as much, but in areas along rivers, we're actually losing quite a bit of forest. And so there's some reforestation potential there. We also look at indicator species, especially endemic species that are reliant on specific habitat for their survival and to avoid extinction. And so you can kind of see how a salamander and a frog are doing in terms of having enough habitat for survival. And then what's interesting from a coffee point of view is we look at production. We look at suitability by altitude, as well as coffee production and yield levels from a historic trend all the way through to 2015. And we'll get into a little bit of how coffee is relating to deforestation and forest cover in the next slide. And finally, we look at human well-being. And a lot of times what we're doing is we're using some proxy indicators to figure out how are people doing in this area. So one is electrification. Do they have electricity? Are they using lights? And you'll see like a rural to urban comparison for this region. We look at water in terms of what types of water sources do people really have in their households? Where are they getting their water? And what, and how that might affect their health. And we also look at what they use for cooking fuel, because that has direct implications for potentially why some of this forest is being lost. And so what you'll see is there's still a lot of firewood being used in the rural areas. Next slide. And so one thing I want to make sure that we hammer home on this one is that in Ocotepeque, unfortunately, coffee is a significant driver. It's the primary driver of forest loss in this particular region. 57% of the land that was previously forest now has coffee growing on it. And the way that we do this is we take those red dots that you saw in the previous map and we sample those to see what did they become. And so based on the random sampling of the points, we found, and and then we use remote imagery, like finer scale remote imagery sensing to figure out what did it become, and then we verify on the ground 20% of those points. And then what we find is our accuracy rating is about 80% for that. So we have pretty high confidence levels in what we're seeing. When it's not just coffee, there's pasture, there's fallow, there's annual crops as well. But if we're going to address forest loss in this particular area, we have to work in coffee. So next slide. That last one. And so what we did with that information and what's in the narrative side of these cards is we identify opportunities and needs for this particular landscape in Ocotepeque. And so, of course, it's no surprising when we look at this data, we think about, okay, should we be implementing more efficient cook stove programs to reduce the dependency on firewood? Can we reforest areas above 1,800 meters above sea level and within 50 meters of the rivers where we were seeing higher rates of lack of forest or clearing? So we can also be in compliance with forest policies that the government has in those regions. We also look at fire. We didn't show that in here, but we look at fire prevalence, and so also looking at opportunities to do more better fire control. We look at opportunities for long-term viability of coffee in the region, so youth targeted programs to sustain coffee production. As part of that longer term thinking, we also look at farm renovation to optimize productivity, reduce climate vulnerability, and then looking at technology to streamline the data collection, like what Daniela presented earlier. And then in terms of what Keely presented, some of this idea, like for these lower altitudes that might be less suitable for coffee in the longer term, what can we do to promote crop diversification and reduce vulnerability? So just to conclude, like we use this for Conservation International for how we identify what we target investment towards in these landscapes. But we use this type of thinking for all of our programming. One of our key pillars is sustainable landscapes and seascapes. So we use this modeling and this type of analysis to really identify what we invest in the field. And what we're trying to do now with it is to identify where, from a person who works on coffee in this organization, where should we be targeting our coffee-related investments that are going to have the greatest impact on forest conservation? And so we're doing some new work now to map coffee areas in, we're about to launch this work in Colombia and Indonesia to map at a national scale coffee and forests, and then help us identify the next landscapes where we would do this work in those countries. With that, I'll turn it back over to, I think, Keely, to round this up.
Yep, thanks so much, Bambi. Super interesting and really important work. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Kate.
Thanks, Keely. Yeah, that was great. Thank you to all the speakers. We had quite a few speakers on this session today, but we really wanted to paint, you know, a rich picture of all of the different ways that you can be measuring and monitoring climate work, CSA work at different levels. So hopefully that's kickstarted some thoughts. So if you all have questions, please feel free to write them into the chat box, into the Q&A box. We do have some questions that have already come in. So I'll start with, for Pablo, some questions about the on-farm climate vulnerability tool. Someone asked, we have two questions here. Someone asked, how do you see companies or co-ops using the results of this tool to make practice changes? How will that directly inform changes in practices? And then the other question, will the results of the survey that you're using right now in the field be shared with the sector and with the national coffee platforms?
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I think that first it will help the extension agent teams to identify which are the key practices that farmers are not adopting and that are key to increase resilience against climate change. And then, as much as they continue to monitor the adoption, it will help to finally understand if farmers are adopting or not the practices, and also to evaluate if they are sending the right, or they are using the right tools to transfer these extension agent messages, like farmer field books, for example, farmer field schools, for example. Then the other one, if data can be shared, I think that finally that will depend on who probably is financing the application of the tool. If they are interested in making the data public, I think that it's possible to do it, but maybe some of them, they would like to keep it as an internal information. From my point of view, I think that making this information public will make a lot of sense, but finally that will depend on who is financing the application of the tool.
Mm-hmm. But in this case, Pablo, where we're using this within the ARC project, we can make that information public.
Yeah, I think that finally, if it's coming through the project, I think it's public. But finally, in the future, if somebody else is interested to applicate the tool, we need to analyze case by case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe that's actually a good segue to another question that came in that I think either Daniele or maybe George could speak to. There was a question about, if you are using different tools, if you're measuring out the farm landscape, supply chain level, how can we avoid, as an industry, as a collective, how can we avoid double or even triple measurement? So kind of speaking to what Pablo was saying, if people are collecting information in certain projects and not sharing that information, how do we kind of avoid duplicating work?
George, would you care to go first?
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So, rightfully, as you've said, one of the other things that I didn't mention that we are also trying to see how it can be done is really one of the ways that people, collect for multiplicity is at times feeling like, they are collecting different things, yet at the end of the day, it's supposed to give you the same reason or the same conclusion. So one of the other things that we are doing as part of other projects that we have to support these, and this one we are particularly also working together with CSA, is really to see for the kind of measurement on a particular issue, what are the different kinds of data that people are collecting, and how can we then ensure that we have sort of either a standard or a common way of doing these, or a described way of doing these, such that because we see the multiplicity in two ways. One, if you're working with two projects and they require different sets of data, then you end up collecting, you end up feeling like you're collecting it differently. But the other part is also different organization collecting from the same project in different ways. So the idea here is really to look at the end game and really see how can we sort of like map the different ways that people do it, also to avoid that kind of duplication. Daniela, maybe you could also add a bit on this.
I think that was brilliantly said. It is, the future is not abusing farmers or communities or wasting resources to keep gathering the same data. This is already beginning to happen in the financial sector as different actors begin to aggregate data and make it available to lenders, for example. So the beginning is there. Big challenge, as George points out, is that people measure things in substantially different ways. And so the project we're undertaking globally with the GCP is to create a consistent approach to those metrics that is used across the board already, or at least to a significant extent, and then to create the interoperability for databases to talk to each other. So the ultimate purpose of that is that over time, we're looking at the same data more and more in the same way. We're able to begin sharing it, and then the next step is the easy one, where people will see, okay, that data already exists here. Why would I go out and get it again? I could either pay for that at a much reduced cost, or increasingly have access to that in the common space in an open data network. So that's yet to be determined, but absolutely, this idea of having this high quality data and getting it once is vital. And a lot of places we do measure not just 2, 3, 4, sometimes even more times the same sorts of things. So we would definitely want to avoid that in the future and be able to expand the metrics to learning rather than the doing of the measurement in the field. And that learning only comes from having common metrics. If we all measure it differently, we don't understand each other. It's like a different language. So that's part of the huge effort that's ongoing right now and should finish this year. That GCP is leading, and it includes this funding from ISEAL, it includes Rainforest, it includes Alliance, it includes UTS and others. So it's a good team.
Great, thanks Danielle and George. We have a question here for Bambi. So how do you make sure the right people are in the room when you're moving from the landscape assessment framework to developing a common action plan for a landscape?
It's a great question. That's probably one of the most challenging parts, is to make sure we do have the right stakeholders in the room. It's a lot of networking, honestly. So through Conservation International's work, we have great relationships with the governments where we work. We have to, in order to have the license to operate there. We leverage our corporate relationships globally and locally to figure out, okay, who are the key supply chain actors to be in that room, and to make sure we have representation from farmer organizations, from trading companies, from roasters, et cetera, in that room. And then on the NGO side, you're using kind of our ears to the ground in terms of understanding like who is working in that region, to make sure that we understand the actors and what they're doing and what their interests are, and making sure we have like socially minded organizations as well as environmentally focused organizations there. But a lot of it is trying to figure out, okay, working with the government agencies and actors to figure out, okay, who has to be here. But then also, you know, we do this ideally, and this is where the Honduras one was a little bit more tricky, because we don't have a field program in this region in Honduras. So there we were leveraging Neumann Foundation's contacts and connections, as well as, you know, our corporate engagement connections, et cetera. But it's kind of just trying to figure out, okay, who's who in that region, who are the data owners, who are the experts, and then as you identify one, you ask who else should be here, and who else should be here. It's kind of like when you network for a job, who else should I be speaking with? Who would you recommend be at this meeting? And so that's really how it works on the ground. Unfortunately, it's no cleaner than that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bambi. I think that answers the question. And then we have one more for Daniele. How does the evolution of technology affect some of these issues?
Dramatically, fortunately. And I think Bambi pointed it out, I think very, very astutely, that it changes the game, essentially. It enables us to see things that we couldn't see before. And perhaps more interestingly, it enables us to take complex pieces, because all of this is dynamic, right? There's no such thing as a static resilience or a static sustainability. All of it's constantly moving, different factors affecting outcomes. So the ability to see that in real time becomes vital. The data you had a year or two ago may not be relevant today. And part of that is that's what technology changes. It enables us to get data much faster, more accurately, and with visualization functions to actually look at layers, look at relationships in ways that were much more difficult to understand in the past. And that, to me, is perhaps a little bit on the path of the grail here of this topic, because if we're going to localize our response to any of these issues of climate change, as I think we must do, I think several, Pablo, Bambi, others have mentioned that topic as well, to put that local power, the decision making, the knowledge in the hands of local people, this technology becomes absolutely a vital function to do that. And so it's important when you can see a governor of a state, or when you can have a cooperative, perhaps a group of farmers, understanding what the conditions are, having a sense of where they're going as well, and the factors that influence those outcomes, being able to then discuss together and work toward a common outcome that works for them in whatever partnership they select, whether that's with government, with an NGO, with a corporate body, with a company and a supply chain, any of those, or all together, ideally. Having access to that data puts them more and more in the driver's seat, at least as a co-participant in development, in reducing the resilience and the stress of climate change. And that's where they should be, not as recipients of something that others are doing externally, but as partners in that process, informing it, being aware of it, and being able to act on it. And all of that really is made possible by the sensors, by the new data sets, and by the ability to bring all that together, including the ability to get low-cost data in the field, right? And that's one that I didn't mention, but is a clear part of that. So there isn't anywhere where technology isn't an absolutely vital piece of the answer here. So I think it's a sort of the critical basis of the future of all of this.
Great, thanks. And we have one more question, I think potentially could be answered by any of you, but maybe Daniele or Bambi could answer this. So the person says there was some reference throughout the presentations to the importance of good graphics and good charts. So do you see that increasing the use of results by stakeholders, and what are other methods of presenting information to ensure that that information is actually used?
Bambi, would you like to go first?
Sure, you can correct anything I get wrong. So, I mean, I think everything that we do has to be put into user-friendly formats for decision makers. It's one of the key things that we try to do on a daily basis, and we don't always get it right, but trying to understand who our audience is and making sure that we get the information to them in the appropriate way. And that's putting it out there in many different formats usually. There's no one size fits all for this. It's like if you're talking to an executive, it needs to be an executive summary. If you're talking to people on the ground, they're going to want more of the data and the why in information. And so we tend to do this in a lot of different ways in terms of trying to make sure we're reaching our audience. And a lot of it is becoming more graphical or maps and oriented, that kind of thing. But, you know, we run up against technology sometimes in terms of what we can do effectively. So there's a lot of new platforms out there that let you look at layers and let you take layers on, take them off. And we've experimented with that, not just with this work, but with a lot of our work. And what we find is there's a small percentage of people that will do that. And there's a larger percentage of people that just want the two-page summary. So we're trying to put things into both. And then we're also trying to make sure that our data reaches tools that companies and decision makers are already using. And so a lot of our effort is also trying to make sure that we understand which are those tools that most stakeholders are using, and how do we integrate more of the results of this work into those tools and resources.
It's hard to add much to that you know, excellent perspective. I think the only thing I might toss on is one piece. I guess it's a lesson of 3 decades of doing this, that, you know, we keep looking for a magic wand to fix or to do development, and there is no magic wand. The magic wand is listening to what local people need, what their perspective is, to their ability to understand, innovate, and solve problems. I think we often forget that in our global wisdom as technology savvy partners, that how you bring data needs to be culturally appropriate. It needs to meet the needs of what someone asked you for. And I think having those discussions is vital. We often miss the voice of the farmer. One of our core commitments at COSA is to help people, and the purpose of data for us, and all of the scientists we work with will tell you, I probably drive them crazy because they like to do research, and we see, you know, where's the voice of the farmer? What's evident that's coming in here? It isn't just about the research. It's making sure that the conditions and the situations of farming come to the fore. So it goes both ways. We need to understand that. And then making it available, we call it data democracy. It's the absolute right of producers and communities who have been part and parcel of contributing the data, of helping us get it. You know, we often forget that they spend time, right, doing these surveys and inputting to many different functions that we have to understand. And then we often don't give it back to them. I think it's frankly a shame that we don't spend more time actively giving that data back in a way that works for them. So for us, it's also, as Bambi said, an integral part of a process, of a discussion, of learning what's going on. And we learned even a couple of decades ago with a project that included Nokia back when it was a big telecom company, Cargill, a large global trader, and the World Bank. We were looking at poverty issues in Indonesia and trying to understand why it was that things weren't moving forward in many communities. And part of it was that the way they were being communicated to was absolutely ineffectual. And so using simple technology, semi-smartphones, and graphic interfaces, the ability to present 4 or 5 pieces of data, you know, maybe 1 or 2 at a time, to a community, sending it back out to them. Once they were able to understand it, it absolutely changed both their adoption of practices as well as their ability to converse about those, to share those with local farmers, and to feed back improvements. So it created this wonderful virtuous loop of information. So they weren't recipients, they were participants in development. And I think ultimately, whether, you know, it's not just about sexy graphics, although that helps, but it really is about understanding what your partners need and about listening ultimately. And then you can deliver that. It sometimes can be something just in the form of numbers, right? We've often been effective telling someone, hey, your yields are 30% lower than farmers who have similar farm size and similar number of trees on their farm. You know, that in itself is really useful, interesting for them to see, so they could begin to get answers. So it need not be complex. It simply needs to be sensitive. And I think that's something I keep learning that, and I think we all could use a lot of that as well. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great place to end this topic on. Thanks, Daniele. Thanks to all of our speakers. I know we're just at the end of our allotted time, but just quickly, Keely, if you could go to the next slide. I did just want to run back through kind of the opportunities that we have for partnership with the ARC project. Keely, I think we lost the slides. I don't know if you can put that back up.
Yeah, sorry, working on it. Maybe I shouldn't have been in charge of this part. Go ahead.
No, just because we fielded some questions from people who are, you know, kind of confused if they're interested in using one of the tools that they've seen referenced within this webinar series, but maybe are not working in Honduras or Uganda, or just kind of want to understand better how they can collaborate with us. I wanted to put up here again. This slide here shows all of the tools that we've been developing within the ARC project and as a consortium in the 3 areas that we've been focused: climate risk analysis, implementation of climate smart agriculture, and testing and research on climate smart agriculture. I won't go into all of these tools. They've been referenced in each of the webinars. So if you see something that piques your interest or you're not quite sure what it is, please go back and look at the webinar posted on the GCP website on that topic, or definitely reach out to me, and I would love to talk your ear off about any of these. And then Keely, if you can go to the next one. So if you see any of those tools or any of those topics, and you know that you need help, you need support, you'd like insight on one of those topics or one of those tools, it does not need to be in Guatemala or Honduras. We can work with you. We can either we can implement one of the tools directly in your supply chain, where essentially we'll do all of the work, come in and do it and provide reports, and we can work out what that would look like. We can train you, we can help you to incorporate one or more of these tools into your sustainability approach. This could be in your general sustainability approach across multiple geographies. It could be piloting it in one location. But the point being here, we'll work with you to make sure that what we can offer fits in with what you're already doing. Or we can develop a full project with you. So again, in whatever location that might be, we can kind of scope out what are you interested in, and what have we already been testing in different places, and how can we bring that into a project jointly with you that kind of answers some of your questions on climate. So that's kind of if you know already which tools are interesting to you. And then the next slide, Keely. If you're not sure, but you know that you want to support this kind of work and you would like to be involved in some way, again, we're looking to develop collective action projects in Honduras and in Uganda. We're also working within ARC in Guatemala. So you could contribute, funding, time, in-kind support to helping us expand our reach within the 3 countries where we're already working on the ground, so that we can reach more farmers, we can do more activities, we can kind of test out more tools, or you could support launching new activities in new locations with particular farmer organizations or particular activities. So really it's pretty open. This project is meant to be a resource to the sector and a catalyst for the sector to get more involved in CSA. So if you're interested, again, Caroline mentioned the survey, please fill out the survey, or contact me, and I'll just stress, the GCP and the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, we're aligned, we're working together on this process, and then the Alliance for Resilient Coffee, which itself is a consortium of many organizations, the Neumann Foundation, HRNS, we are the lead organization, and so I'm coordinating on behalf of the consortium. So when you contact me, it's really, I'm kind of the point person for the rest of that group. So please let me know if you're interested. And I'm sorry we went a few minutes over. Next slide shows where we're at in this webinar series. We will meet again on October 25th, where we'll be looking at the business case for CSA and really at different levels of the value chain, what the business case is for implementing CSA and what the cost of inaction is. So that should be an interesting topic for us. And I think we can leave it there, Caroline, unless you'd like to add anything.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thanks again to all the speakers, and last but not least, all the participants. We hope to see you again on the 25th of October. We will be sending out invitations, of course, for this next very interesting topic. So looking at the ones previously where we have learned very much, you know, what are the risks, what are the tools that can be used, how can CSA be scaled, and today we learned how it can be monitored. But then how do I convince others in my company to support that, to invest in it? And that's what we'll be looking at next time. So yeah, thank you very much. And we hope to see you on the 25th of October again. Bye-bye.